Welcome to Behavioral Health Today, a podcast brought to you by the Triad Network. This podcast is designed to share trending topics occurring within the world and our communities and bring them a behavioral and mental health perspective. Welcome to Behavioral Health Today. I'm your host, Peter Fenger, and my guest today is Sophia Vale Galano. Sophia is a California-based psychotherapist with more than a decade of experience supporting teenagers and adults across residential treatment centers, hospitals, schools, and private practice. Born in Los Angeles and raised in London, she holds a master's degree in social work from NYU and now supervises associate therapists while running her own thriving practice. Sophia brings a deeply holistic approach to mental health, holding an advanced certificate in sex therapy, animal-assisted therapy, and forensic social work, yoga, and Reiki. Her new book, Calming Teen Anxiety, A Parent's Guide to Helping Your Teenager Cope with Worry, is a compassionate, practical roadmap for parents who feel overwhelmed trying to support an anxious teen in today's high-pressured world. Drawing from real-life clinical experience, reflective exercises, and concrete communication tools, Sophia helps parents recognize the root of anxiety, open judgment-free conversations, and know when to seek additional support, so families can move from fear and confusion towards confidence, connection, and emotional resilience. I'm excited to have Sophia with me today. We'll explore the rising tide of teen anxiety and discuss how parents can better understand their teen's emotional world, communicate more effectively, navigate social media and academic pressures, recognize when additional support is needed, and apply practical tools from Sophia's book to create a calmer, more connected home. I'm very excited to have Sophia with me on this show. Sophia, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, likewise. Again, I started off our podcast by sort of talking about your book, and I just want to say, thank you very much for sharing that with me. It's been a pleasure to read. And, I just thought it was a very thoughtful, grounded guide for parents. And I loved how you sort of described what young people are going through and sort of the pressures that many adults don't always see. But before we get into the book, I would love to ask you, what first drew you to focus on teen anxiety, and how did your experiences with teens and their parents ultimately inspire the book?
Yes, yes. Thank you so much. And thank you for the kind words and the lovely introduction and such a great question. Kind of just to provide a little bit of the background and some context is, I've been working with teens and their families for, going on 12 years now in a variety of different settings. So my private practice and school settings, medical settings, inpatient treatment centers, outpatient centers. So I've worked with this population, variety of different settings, but really what motivated me to focus on the population pertaining to anxiety was several years ago. I would go around, and I talk about this in the introduction, the kind of opening chapter of my book. I'd go around to local schools in the Los Angeles area, and I would pick a different subject to speak about. I'd give these kind of parent education talks. So I remember I gave one on vaping, on substance use disorders, on depression. And I remember giving one on adolescent anxiety. And it really, really stood out to me because the room was completely packed. I remember all the seats were filled. There were parents standing along the walls.
Yeah.
And I was just shocked at how many people were there with so many questions about what to do. There's
Mhm.
so many conversations going on right now about how teen anxiety is just on an all-time high. It's really amplified. It's really concerning. But
Yes.
there's often this kind of gap of what do we do with that? And the parents at this talk were so curious about what to say and what not to say. And when I left the talk, that really hit me that I was like, I would love to provide a kind of general overview, a blueprint, a kind of guidebook about what's effective, what's not effective, what actions to
Yes.
take, what actions not to take, what words to lean on, what words to avoid, really something that's accessible and approachable for parents and
Yeah.
something that a parent, I would say with a PhD could pick up and, it could, still resonate with them, or the parent who
Mhm.
didn't finish high school could pick it up and say, okay, I don't need to study this for years and years. I know what to do.
Mhm. Yeah, and again, like the way that you've written the book, it's pretty easy to digest, you know?
Thank
I
you.
think I think not only you providing insight into the teen's experience, you also do a very nice job of sort of sharing some of the testimonials, right? Like you're not just talking about
Hmm.
some of these things, there's actually real stories behind it.
Right.
But one of the things I so appreciate is really the reflection questions, right? Because it gets you to think a little bit more about the concept. I
Hmm.
would even
Yes.
maybe encourage the readers to journal a little bit about it, right?
Yes.
Because
Yes.
beyond just the experience and trying to learn practical tools, I think it also invites for folks to kind of unpack some stuff for themselves and
Yes.
a realization of what they're bringing into some of these conversations.
100%. 100%. And I really appreciate you noting that and highlighting that, and that was really my intention with this book too, is to, bring that to the forefront in a very, again, non-judgmental, mindful manner. And if, we can actually look at this as something that could be very empowering for parents. And, I
Yes.
use the word parents. Obviously, this is, any caregiver adult who's wanting to help their teen, just sort of conversation in the book. I use the word parents, but oftentimes parents can feel very discouraged, particularly if they have a teenager in their life who is very closed off or very resistant or very unwilling to communicate with them. And they're really kind of
Yes.
at a loss of what to do. And actually,
Yes.
for the parent to look within themselves compassionately and mindfully, again, it can be really empowering because that, not only helps, develop empathy and helps the teen, but, helps the parent and also requires no collaboration from the teen.
Yes.
The parent doesn't need the teen to sit down and talk to them in order
Mhm.
to notice change.
Yeah. Oftentimes, the household can be such an important foundation
Right.
for the family's well-being as a whole.
Right. Right.
Yes.
100%. 100%. And this is where, and obviously we go into significant detail in the book, but just like even, a parent, questioning to themselves again mindfully. I know I keep using that word, but there's a reason behind it, really kind of
Yes.
to stress that factor of, what am I modeling? How am I leading by example? Does my teen see me really stressed? Does my teen see me anxious all the time? Does the teen see me perhaps struggle to practice my own self-care or set boundaries? And
Right.
oftentimes it's kind of easier said than done. A lot of adults or parents will, recognize those concepts and know those are very healthy, positive actions to take. But, we get kind of caught up in the day to day, and parenting is really stressful and really
Yes.
challenging. So
It
sometimes it's
is.
helpful to just take a step back.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I want to kind of park on something. You talked a little bit about how anxiety is very widespread right now. And
Right.
you're mentioning that that is difficult to parent. I think parents today have a very different role than the parents
Yeah,
that they grew up with, right?
definitely.
So talk to me a little
Well
bit
said.
about why you believe that anxiety is so severe and widespread right now.
Yes, yes. And oftentimes parents will come to see me for, my therapy practice or reach out to me with that exact question, just even kind
Mhm.
of the lack of understanding or kind of more confusion around it. And really, I feel that there are kind of two sort of kind of clusters here of sort of what are going on in terms of the factors. So we have kind of these classic causes, I call them, which are, what most parents experience during their own adolescence. So those are kind of more of the biological factors, chemical changes, hormonal changes, the brain still developing. Those might feel more familiar for an adult to say, I remember that time in my life. But then in conjunction with that, we have these kind of newer factors. So in my book, I call them kind of the Gen Z effect, because that's really the first generation where we really, really saw this kind of come to life, which are, the impact of social media, technology. Of course, there's some other factors there too, like academic competition, more stress with the
Yeah.
collegiate admissions process. But really, I think some of like the big ones that are kind of like the big, like ding, ding, ding alarm bells for parents are the social media technology
Yes.
factors. So
Mhm.
I am not one to say that, okay, it's just the use of smartphones that are contributing to anxiety. It's just social media. It's just the brain still developing. I personally feel that it's the combination of
Mhm.
everything.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, and just to kind of park a little bit, you talked a little bit about hormonal or sort of like the teen experience, right?
Hmm.
And your
Hmm.
book kind of deciphers between the difference between normal teen behavior and true
Right.
anxiety, right?
Right. Right.
And you're doing a very nice job of sort of gentle reminders of what it was like to be a teenager, right? And those reflection questions, I think that could be really helpful in sort of bridging that experience. Um,
Yes.
but what I want to ask you is what are some of the signs that parents should look for that might be like subtle red flags or something
Right.
that they might overlook?
So, really, what I recommend is to start with, again, mindful observation and using this kind of curious, inquisitive mentality to assess how often a teenager is struggling and how much. So,
Mhm.
really, and I want to also preface by saying that this is really, really confusing. And it's completely understandable if, let's say, a parent has disregarded a teen's anxiety as sort of standard teen angst, because it is really hard to identify. And teenagers are not expert communicators. So they're not going to go to their parent and say, I kind of always joke, I'm like, I haven't met this teenager yet. Maybe they are out there, but the teen is not going to say, mom, dad, I'm really struggling emotionally. I would benefit from more emotional regulation techniques and coping skills and grounding tools. Like, no, the teen isn't going to say that. The teen instead is going to seem irritable, is going to seem argumentative, maybe even hostile, isolative, very unlike themselves, and
Mhm.
to an adult, I could be like, well, they're just being a maybe teenager, when in reality something more serious could be going on. So
Right.
just to kind of keep that in the back of my mind, or everyone's
Yes.
mind while we go on with this. But with that in mind, it again goes back to this, how often a teen is struggling and to what extent. So
Mhm.
I give this example, and again, it's a very generalized example, but let's say there's a teenager that's feeling nervous or stressed before a math test. They're feeling overwhelmed. They're feeling, nervous about what's going to happen. However, they go and they sit through the test. They take the test. They go on with their day. They complete their other assignments. They attend their extracurriculars. They socialize with their friends, kind of business as usual. Okay, are we gonna completely overlook that? No, but we're gonna take a very different approach with the teen who, let's say, has a panic attack before the exam, or the teen who throws up before the exam, or the teen who refuses to go to school because of the exam, or drops out of their extracurriculars, or is so preoccupied with the outcome of this exam that they are unable to complete their other
Mhm.
assignments. That's
Mhm.
kind of cause for a little bit more concern. And with that being said, again, we want to assess how often it happens. So let's say a teenager does have that type of response, that seems quite extreme.
Mhm.
Let's say that happens once a year. Okay, are we going to completely write it off and ignore it? No. But again, different approach than, let's say, the teenager where that happens, once a week, once a
Mhm.
month, several times a month, several times a week. Absolutely. We're definitely going to want to take a closer look. But again, it can be a little tricky to identify.
Yeah. Are there any behaviors from parents that you see sort of enabling that?
Yes.
Like some,
Yes.
some of the examples that I've heard is that some parents will take their children out of class because they're not
Yes.
feeling well, and it's
Yes.
mental health related. That's
Yes.
becoming a little bit more normalized, but I don't know if
Mhm.
that's like a cause for concern.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much for bringing that up. And and this is something I kind of address sort of later in the book, because it's a really complicated area. And again,
Yes.
really tricky, because what I want to find is a nice balance here, where we're not
Hmm.
completely disregarding a teen's anxiety, but we're also not rescuing or we're not enabling teens,
Yes.
because ultimately that can cause more anxiety and also lead to a plethora of other problems.
Hmm. Hmm.
Which could be a whole separate topic in itself. But I'm definitely seeing that. So, just to go off of that example with the math test, I wouldn't recommend, and again, I want to say that, of course, there are going to be emergency situations that are, exceptions to this. But, rescue or enabling would be the parent saying, okay, my kid can't take the assignment. So can you just give them a passing mark, or can they get more extra
Yes.
credit, or, the kind of parent immediately intervening versus having a conversation with the teen, seeing how the teen can proceed with the exam and develop that resilience, even if, let's say, they don't get, an A on the exam. Let's say they get a C, like
Mhm.
recognizing that it's okay. It's an opportunity for growth, but again, it can be a little tricky to
Yes.
identify, and often requires parents to kind of take their hands off the steering wheel at times, which is very anxiety provoking for the parent.
Yes. Yeah, and again, that's where you're sort of talking about this like dual relationship, right? I think that you're doing a very nice job in your book of sort of outlining the work for the parent to do, but then also giving them the skills to equip their teen.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
So I say, and again, I know this is quite generalized. So I say, like, if there's ever, let's say, substance abuse, self-harm, suicidality, this does not apply here, but we want the teen to be okay, metaphorically scraping their knees. We don't want to let the teen kind of break their knee, but we want them to
Right.
see like, oh, it's okay for me to not have to be perfect all the
Yes.
time, or it's okay to see that, I can struggle and I can actually get through it. And that's really
Mhm.
good for my self-esteem. That actually helps combat my anxiety and helps me feel better about myself. But it's often easier to want to just step in and
Yeah.
rescue. So that comes from
Yes.
the very concerned and caring parents out there.
Yeah, yeah. So many good parts that you're outlining right there. But one of the tools that we talked about was active listening,
Yes,
right? And it sort of starts there, right? Mindful observation, active listening. These are ways to engage with your child, but not necessarily act upon it, right? That can be very
right.
difficult. So,
Of
what does
course.
that actually look like when a parent is listening well? What habits have you seen that might actually cause a teen to shut down?
Yes, yes. So, and a lot of my work with the teen is also, reminding them of this, which is that, most parents, it goes against their instincts to kind of just
Mhm.
sit back and practice kind of active listening. When they see that their child is suffering, they want to alleviate the problem, and that's completely understandable, and most parents up until thus far, that's what they've done. I kind of reference, it sounds quite extreme, but when the child is a baby, if they're crying, it's you don't sit down with the baby and say, let's talk about how that feels for you. You give them the bottle, you change their diaper, like you take these, very action steps. So the parents are kind of, relearning, that it's going from
Yes.
these kind of like solution fixing based mentality
Mhm.
to active listening. And, again, that's learning for the parents. But, unfortunately, what can happen is when parents kind of revert back to that fixing and solution based mentality, it actually pushes the teen farther away, even if the parent is coming from a positive place. So, I'll have teenagers that come to see me, for therapy, and they say, I tried to talk to my parent about feeling anxious. And my parent said, well, have you meditated or have you gone outside? Why don't you go for a walk? And let's be real, those are great solutions and, they do work. But at the same time, the teen doesn't want to hear that in the time. The teen actually
Yes.
wants to feel listened to and wants to feel validated and understood. And that ultimately is going to provide more of a solution to the teen in the long run.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so good. And you know what? The pro tip is that those skills follow you throughout life.
Right.
Even if
Hmm.
you're 40 years old like myself and you're talking to somebody else 40 years old, they too want those same basic needs.
Course. Yes. Yes, absolutely. And we forget that as well.
Yes.
And teens are in this kind of unusual time of their life because they're sort of still like, half kid, half an adult,
Right.
so it's like kind of finding the balance of both. And then there
Mhm.
are times again where it is appropriate to provide solutions. Like I said, emergency situations, like we want to provide solutions. Or if, the teen asks for it, of course, go ahead and collaborate with teen in terms of finding some solutions together. Though that is really, really important. It's important for the teen to feel heard, feel that they're a part
Yeah.
of, and that they're coming to this on their own, even if they're seeking your help.
Yeah. Yeah. So good. So I know one of the parts in your book that I connected with was this relationship between the parent and the child and how the parent's own anxiety can really transfer to their teen. I know your book outlines some really great reflection questions to the reader, but how can caregivers recognize their role in the dynamic and really regulate themselves so they can stay calm and create a safe presence?
Yes, yes. No, that's a great question, and I want to put this out there too that, I say this in a completely non sort of blaming manner at all, because being a parent is really, really hard and it's challenging and stressful and exhausting and anxiety provoking. So those feelings are so
Yes.
real, so completely understandable to feel that way. And again, a lot of my work with the teen is also helping the teen try to have some compassion for the parent, with the parents doing the
Yes.
best that they can. But really, I think teens, generally speaking, are a little more aware than they might lead on, and they really do pick up on a lot of that energy, So this is where
Yes.
it goes back to, what is the teen seeing in me? Am I really anxious? Am I really stressed all the time? Could my teen, perhaps even subconsciously without them even realize, following my lead with
Hmm.
that. And, kind of more from a kind of experimental lens, this could be a nice way of looking at it, is for the parent to see, okay, well, when I show up and I'm a little more regulated or a little more calm or a little more relaxed, what is my team like around me? Am I noticing any differences? And I'll say that this is something that typically doesn't happen overnight. And also, the teen is not going to go to the parent and say, Mom, Dad, I'm so glad that you're regulating more. And I sense your calm energy and demeanor. And now I'm, modeling after you. So the teen also is not going to say that. So the teen might not express recognition of that or even their gratitude of that. So even if the teen isn't saying that, for the parent to not get discouraged, that it is really helpful. I mean, it's helpful for the teen, and again, it's helpful for the parent. It's
Yes.
it's healing on both sides.
Yes. Yeah. And in your book, you provide some really great examples. One of the ones I thought was very complex was the relationship between the daughter and her family, where the mother had self-image issues with
Yes,
herself. She talked to the daughter positively, but she had a very negative sense of her own self, and that
yeah,
transferred to the teen. And
yes,
again,
I
I
see
just
that a
thought that
lot.
that was a very good example of how some of these things can get transferred unconsciously.
Of course, of course. And it's unconscious and oftentimes it's
Mhm.
very unintentional. Like
Yes.
parents are heartbroken and they feel terrible when they
Yes.
kind of draw these conclusions. And that's why, again, my approach is, from this compassionate lens that, parents are doing the best they can. And even if, let's say, a parent, reads this and is like, oh my God, I've done absolutely everything wrong, up this far, that it's never a lost cause, it's
Right.
okay. There's always chances to heal. and
Yes.
and and oftentimes, like, it is more of the messages that we're giving to ourselves that our teen picks up on, because ultimately, the teen said, my parent is saying that to themselves, so is that maybe, quote unquote, how I should be talking to
Right.
myself? Why would I not talk to myself that
Right.
way if my parents are talking to themselves that way? Again, teens are aware, but repeating myself here, not expert communicators, so might not be able to kind of verbalize that. But we see things like that happen a lot, where pressures that the parents put on themselves are then, kind of unconsciously sort of passed on to the teens. And it's almost this kind of like invisible sort of
Yes.
charge or current.
Mhm.
So it's just very powerful, even just to bring our awareness to that.
Yeah. Yeah. And to sort of highlight a point that you made, it's not too late to start. You don't have to be a perfect parent. We're not perfect. But
Yes.
just the act of starting can be the difference for going forward.
Yes. Yes. And what an amazing message even that sent to
Mhm.
the teen too, to show the teen
Yes.
that, like, you don't have to have it all together. You don't have to
Mhm.
be perfect, and this is also an important piece of this, because parents will say to me, well, I know that it's not, kind of paraphrasing here, as quote unquote, it's not good for me to be stressed in front of my teen. Yes, there's truth to that. And at the same time, we also don't want you to be a robot. We want
Yeah.
also, the team to see you as a human being that,
Mhm.
is imperfect. And that's
Mhm.
okay. And it's also
Mhm.
okay for parents to say to their teens, if there is a time where the parent just knows they can't show up for the teen at that time, even if I kind of mentioned the sort of one of the early chapters of having a conversation with the teen. If the parent knows that they are running on so little sleep, they know they're going to get a work call in 5 minutes. They know that the teen sibling is going to come in and ask them, "Hey, where's dinner?" and they're going to be distracted. It's okay to also say to the teen, I really want to be present for you, and I know that this isn't going to go how I want it to
Mhm.
be. I know that I can't be as present for you. When can we find a time to talk about this? Or how can I be there for you? And it's okay to do that.
We'll be right back after a word from our sponsor.
Today's episode is brought to you by Jane, a practice management software and EMR built to support you in the day-to-day work of running your business. If you're a health or wellness practitioner, you already know the care you provide starts well before your patient arrives and extends far beyond the treatment room. Jane is here to support every part of that experience. With online booking, your clients can book at a time that works for them, and with features like waitlist notifications, they'll be able to grab last-minute openings when they pop up. It's an easy way to keep your schedule full while getting your patients the care they need. During your appointment, Jane's AI-powered documentation feature can help you thoroughly take notes so you can stay present with the person in front of you. And after appointments, you can end your time together on a healing note, not a transactional one, by charging the card on file and rebooking before they head out. Personally, when I was looking for a therapist, Jane made the entire experience feel effortless. Booking an appointment was simple, I could choose the practitioner who felt right for me, and all my upcoming sessions were easy to see in one place. Jane even made it possible for me to join my appointments virtually through video calls, which fit perfectly into my schedule. And with built-in messaging, my therapist could check in with me between sessions, helping me stay supported and motivated throughout the week. Jane didn't just help me book an appointment, it helped me show up on time, stay engaged, and keep moving forward between sessions. To learn more about how Jane can support you and your patients, head to jane.app/demo. And if you're ready to get started with Jane, you can use our code TRIAD1MO or TRIAD1MO for 1 month grace period on your new account. When your work is about people, Jane supports the process. You know, it can really shift a room to recognize that we don't have the answers right now. Like we
Yes.
can really just kind of approach something and say, boy, we're really stuck right now.
Yes.
And I think that it can not only just sort of change the room, but it can also show your teen that you can be imperfect. You don't have to have the right answers. Part of being an
Right.
adult is thinking that you have the right answers or
Mm,
thinking that at some point I'm going to have it all. And the realization is that we aren't perfect. Sometimes we're just
right.
kind of going by the fly. And I think
Definitely.
one of the other points that you're making is being very conscious or intentional about being a good role model.
Yes.
And
Yes.
and even just recognizing that you have influence on showing up for yourself that then can
Yes.
sort of ripple into the rest of the family. I think that that's a really good chapter of your book and
Thank you.
recognizing that, you know, that there's a role in being a parent and that we can display our best selves and that
Yes.
too can get picked up, you know, sometimes subconsciously to our
Yes.
families.
Yes, yes. And the team might note it in passing. And even if
Mhm.
it feels really, really minuscule to a parent, it's a really big deal, and like
Yeah.
even I think I use one of these kind of quotes or references because I hear it a lot is, if I have a teen that comes to see me for therapy, they'll sometimes say things like, well, I'm fine being here. My parents have been in therapy. Like we talk about therapy, or, my
Yes.
parents are in 12 step, or, so I'm used to being around people who talk about their feelings. It's not a big deal, So it's interesting, it can be this kind of like passing, fleeting comment, but it says so much about what the teen sees at
Yeah.
home.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, like what you're really suggesting is maybe like a willingness to kind of get the support.
Yeah.
But I want to talk
Hmm.
about the other side, right? When you're finding
Hmm.
that a teen is resistant to talking or closed off, we can
Hmm.
have all the greatest listening skills, but
Right.
sometimes there's just a riff, right?
Yep.
And
Hmm.
sometimes the communication can be difficult. So then how can parents gently open up that door without maybe pushing or
Right.
causing defensiveness? What are some of the strategies that you might suggest?
Yes, yes. And again, of course, I know I keep repeating this, but there is a reason. Emergency exceptions, different here, but generally speaking, and this might feel very unusual for adults. So often when I suggest some of these, kind of tools or interventions, they are like, what? That sounds way too informal. It sounds too casual, but that's actually what helps the teen open up. So, most teens are, not going to do as well as maybe an adult would if, let's say, we're going to have a family meeting, we're sitting at the dining room table, we're going to talk about your mental health. Okay, the teen's going to feel very put on the spot, very caught off guard. And, most teens are going to close down with that. Not all teens, of course. There are some teens that are receptive to that, but most teens aren't. What you actually would find is that most teens will start to open up while they're in the car with their parent, where they're not sitting face to face, where they're driving, and the parent, finishes the car ride, and then they're like, "Wait, what? I feel like I just learned more about my teen's life while we were sitting in traffic for 15 minutes than all the times we've been at dinner together." So remembering that for teens, often it's not sitting face to face; it's in a setting that's maybe a little more casual, a little more informal. But the keyword here is for teens to feel that it's very organic, that it comes up very
Yes.
naturally. And,
Mhm.
Even things like, I will suggest that, parents will sit and watch TV or watch movies with their teens where, let's say, there's a storyline where there's some sort of, character with a mental health diagnosis, whether it's anxiety, depression, substance use. And, again, a lot of parents might find that strange because that's not how adults might begin that conversation, but it can bring things up more naturally for the
Yes.
teenager.
Yeah, what you're talking about is being very intentional about the environment,
Yes.
right? It
Yes.
does not have to feel pressure of, please sit down on the table. We need to have a conversation. It can feel like a family dinner. It can
Yes.
feel like a car ride. It can
Right.
feel like saying goodnight to somebody
Yes.
in their bedroom. These are moments that you can build into your family's routine that open up these conversations. And what you're talking about, like, hey, when we see something, an article in the news, or we, are watching a television show with a good topic, those
Hmm.
are invitations to kind of extend it beyond
Yes.
just that moment.
Yes, I like that word you use, that they're invitations.
Hmm.
Exactly. That, not to overlook it as like, well, this seems silly, or this seems like, again, it's not serious enough. Like
Yes.
this isn't a serious enough platform because mental health is really serious. Anxiety is really serious. But oftentimes that can push a teen farther away of like, okay, well, now it feels kind of more like an authority figure talking to me, or it's like
Hmm.
I'm put on the spot. So it's important for parents to just think creatively about different ways to approach conversation with the teen.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to talk about the big elephant in the room, that's social media. And I know that social media in today's society is really difficult to navigate as a parent. From a parent's perspective, it can be both confusing to
Hmm.
understand, and there's also
Yes.
a lot of fear wrapped up in it with just the
Right.
dangers of being online. So I know in the book you're advising parents to not take a restrictive approach, this abstinence-based approach to social media. You're also encouraging to help the teen curate their gallery, which I loved.
Yes. Thank
So
you.
help explain to our listeners what that means and why that's a more effective approach.
Yes. Yeah. So generally speaking, I really do absolutely, just to echo what you said, I lean on more of kind of, let's call it like a harm reduction type approach, or, modifying a teen's social media use versus prohibiting or restricting their social media use. And, I come from this place where, I really believe that social media is not going anywhere. And we actually want to give teenagers the tools now
Yes.
when they're at home, when they're in a safe space with their parents versus completely restricting their access and prohibiting it. And then they turn 18 and then they're exposed to all of this and they don't know how to use it in an effective, positive manner.
Right.
So, and again, different situations here and there, but, generally speaking, this is where it's helpful for parents. I mean, A, to just educate themselves about, what social media is like these days, but more than anything, to really have a conversation with the teen
Mhm.
from, again, a curious, understanding, kind of more inquisitive mindset. It's like kind of the overarching themes here, and talking to their teen of, how do you feel when you're on social media? Do you notice you feel a certain way when you look at certain pages, certain people? And I use this analogy of kind of social media as an art gallery, which is helping the teen decide what they want to see on there, who they want to follow based on how it makes them feel,
Yes.
So this isn't having the parent go in and delete who they're following or saying, no, you have to block this person, you have to restrict this person. It's collaborating with the teen and saying, hey, how would you feel about temporarily muting this person if you know that that doesn't make you feel good? How do you feel
Mhm.
about maybe sprinkling in some pages that make you feel a little bit happier? Like maybe some pages that are more related to like your hobbies or your interests, and that, let's be real, is going to take a little bit of encouragement from the parent. Most teenagers, again, like some will join social media, for their hobbies and interests, but most won't join to, follow inspirational quote pages,
Mhm.
but sometimes integrating those in there can actually really help the
Mhm.
teenager. So instead of
Mhm.
resisting social media, let's kind of use it to our advantage, but a little bit here, and it can be really positive and help the teenager feel, okay, my parent is actually treating me like an adult and not trying to control me like a child
Yes.
here.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love the example that you're giving because you're really kind of empowering them to curate the social media that they want, right?
Yes.
we are in an age where the algorithm is so important to people's engagement. Sometimes we lose
Hmm.
touch with our feelings. If your consumption is a lot like mine, I get so many messages. There'll be a headline from news followed by some funny meme.
Right.
And I can scroll and I can scroll and I scroll. And then I recognize that the headlines from the news are starting to make me feel bad.
Yes.
And then
Yes.
I recognize that I have to detach from social media. But there's a step in between that you're talking about where if I can curate my experience, then maybe the social media experience doesn't put me down that rabbit hole.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And it can also shift and change too. So that's
Yes.
the other
Yes.
thing too. And
It
like
can shift and
that's
change.
yeah, and that's where it's important. Generally speaking, this is another theme here, which is just, you know, keeping an open dialogue and
Yes.
continuing to communicate. And also, for parents to remember, like, just because I've had one conversation about social media doesn't mean it needs to be the last. Or just because the parent said, okay, I've talked to my teen once about anxiety or what that might look like or feel like, I've checked it out of the box. Like, it's still there. Let's continue to
Hmm.
check in with
Hmm.
this. And also, recognize that the teen is also growing and changing too. How a 14-year-old might feel about social media is going to be different than a 17-year-old might
Yes.
feel about social media too. So it's also something
Hmm.
to keep in mind.
Yeah, and one of the approaches that I've loved so much about your book is that you're encouraging parents to have a relationship or a parenting style that reminds them of the consequences, but isn't restrictive to their actions. And
Right.
what I mean by that is we can have a conversation with our teen that says, hey, here's what we're going to do, or here's what I'd like you to do if we were to run into XYZ situation.
Yes.
There are a lot of dangers online, but if I
Of
can
course.
get ahead of it and I can talk to you about it, then you have a step-by-step plan of what I'd want you to do in order to be safe. Because I'm
Right.
coming from that perspective. I'm telling you about this because I want to give you some freedom, but I want you to understand that there are consequences. And when those
Yeah.
consequences aren't met, then there's going to be, some action that's attached to it, whether it's punishment, restriction, et cetera, et cetera. You lay that out so that they can have the understanding ahead of time.
Right, right. And it's boundaries, that's
Hmm.
that's so pivotal here. Boundaries are so, so pivotal. Restriction, control, enabling, rescuing, that's where things get more destructive. But boundaries are healthy, and that's also something that's helpful for parents to, constantly be just assessing of what are my boundaries like with my teenager
Hmm.
at this point. And they can also change and grow
And they can
as
also
the
change.
yeah, and that's
That's right.
okay.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that's right. That's right. So I know in my own journey, it took me a long time to separate effort from achievement. And I'm
Mhm.
constantly reminding myself of this, even in my own work. But I know that teens have a lot on their plate.
Right.
So academic pressure, competition, overloaded
Mhm.
schedules, those are all
Mhm.
huge anxiety drivers.
Yep.
Um, how can parents help their teens reframe achievement and really prioritize emotional well-being?
That's a great question here, and this is where it goes back to having conversation with their team too, So again, collaborating versus, just telling the team.
Mm-hmm.
That goes back to kind of the solution-based mentality or fixing. Again, even if it comes from a positive place and the parent is right, still we want to have a conversation with the teen about that. But really, you are the parent. When I say you, the parent is really kind of working against culture here by having this conversation, which is using opportunities I call in my book kind of like I don't really like the word mistakes. I kind of like it is more as like opportunities for growth.
Learning.
Learning, yes, lessons and recognizing that that's positive, and
Yes.
really helping the teen see that they don't have to be successful and accomplished and high achieving in order to have that self-worth, that they can
Mhm.
still have self-worth even if they quote unquote fail or even if
Mhm.
they quote unquote make a mistake, it is an opportunity for learning and that's okay. But again, keeping in mind that most people are not having that type of conversation. Again, I know it's a generalized statement here, but that's not really in our culture at this point
Mhm.
in time. We are very, kind of reward based here. So for our parents to be really patient with this one, that this is going to take some time, but the teen is also looking to the parent. What is the parent, once again, what's the parent like when they make a mistake, when the parent quote unquote fails, or when the parent does something wrong? are they compassionate with themselves, or do they beat themselves up because they did something wrong here? It's another opportunity for modeling and leading by example.
Yeah. Yeah. All those skills that really help build resilient children.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. The
Right.
resilience piece is so crucial.
So I know as parents, we want to do our best, but sometimes it requires additional support beyond the home, right? What markers or moments tell you that it's time for professional help?
Okay.
And
Yeah.
what should parents do if there's resistance from the teen?
So, as a therapist, obviously, I'm a little bit biased because I'm going to say that any time is a positive
Mhm.
time to seek additional help. So, oftentimes parents will say to me, hey, my teen is kind of saying that, they might want to go to therapy, but I don't really think there are that many stresses. And I think, okay, they seem pretty regulated. Do they really need it? I would still, if possible, support that, that anytime that a teen has extra guidance, mentorship, support is going to be positive for them, so really any time is
Yeah.
a good time to reach out. It doesn't have to be a crisis to get
Yes.
support. So I
Mhm.
want to put that out there too. So keeping that in mind, also keeping in mind that support can look very different for
Yes.
every teen. And this is where, it kind of goes to your second question of when there's a resistant teen, of having a conversation about what type of support intrigues them or might feel more interesting for them.
Yes.
For some
Yes.
teens, they're very open and receptive to, okay, I'll try traditional therapy. And other teens are like, absolutely not. I do not want to sit in a room and, sit face to face, talk to some old person about my problems. No, but they're more receptive to let me find kind of a coach who will go out and kind of mentor me, or, maybe we'll go on walks and we'll talk about things, or we'll do some sort of group work or some sort of
Mm.
activity, or, get involved in some other type of healing, and
Mhm.
for parents to recognize that it is, again, not a one size fits all, and not all support looks like traditional therapy,
Mhm.
particularly when there is a resistant teen, because sometimes that can be really discouraging, which is that my teen won't go to therapy. Well, maybe I'll go to something else that might help
Yes.
them,
Mhm.
and to try different avenues. And it's also okay, if you kind of have to keep searching or
Right.
shopping, I call it,
Mhm.
that,
Yeah.
continue to explore.
Yes. Yeah. You know what? I think one of the best things that came out of 2020, as difficult as that year was, and not to say that these resources wasn't available, but just the amplification of mental well-being services, right?
Yes.
And again, like understand from a parent perspective, it doesn't have to look like talk therapy. It can look like
Hmm.
group therapy. It can look like somatic therapy. There are other means to wellness that can really
Right.
help regulate the body in
Right.
really neat ways that
Yeah.
it's just the whole field is just expanding in so many interesting
Exactly.
ways. So like you're
Exactly.
saying, there are other ways around approaching this kind of support that doesn't look
Hmm.
like talk therapy. And just as you're suggesting, things can change, right?
Yes.
Maybe you start with something and we work our way toward it.
Yes, yes, definitely. And again, repetitive here, but unless emergency situation,
Yes.
I don't encourage parents to force their teen to get support.
Mhm.
But this is where it's really important for the parent to make sure that they're not rescuing or enabling, because again, to go back to that other example, that I referenced earlier about the teen who's really anxious before the math test. If that teen will refuse to go to therapy, refuses to do coaching, refuses to do a group, refuses any type of support, this is where it's imperative that the parent does not reach out to the teacher all the time and say, no, 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 my teen can't come to school. My teen, because why would that teen ever get help if the parent's going to bail them out all the time?
Yeah.
But this is so, so tough. And this is where it is so important for the parent to make sure they have their own support here.
Yes. Yeah. 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 So I know your book, it offers a plethora of practical and everyday tools to help reduce teen anxiety. But what are some of your favorite strategies, and what might you suggest for parents listening today?
Oh, that's such a good question. Thank you. Well, really, overall, what I want to highlight here is really the willingness behind
Mm.
it. So even if, let's say, a parent isn't, excelling at, all the, correct tools, the correct words, and the correct action, the willingness is really what matters here, and this is where, as a therapist, I really mean this. I'm really grateful for parents who just want to help. The
Mhm.
teen ultimately will recognize that or feels that, whether again they're verbalizing it or not. Who knows? Maybe they'll verbalize it in like 30 years or something, but it's really the willingness and for the
Yeah.
parent to give themselves credit and a ton of self compassion for being on this journey more than anything is just recognizing that they are doing the best they can and to be really proud of themselves that they're being an amazing parent for simply even just trying to show up for their teen. And that's really what it's all about.
Yeah. We so badly want these grand sweeping changes, and we see a lot of stuff on social media, but we also have to recognize that there's a lot of work that goes into this, and
Yes.
small wins are what get you there. Small
Yes.
wins.
Yes. Thank you for saying that. Yes. And, I remind parents of this all the time that if they see even, 1% progress, if their teen
Mhm.
opens up to them for 10 seconds, that's really, really positive and not to overlook the small changes.
Yeah, yeah. So, Sophia, I've so appreciated our conversation today. But before we go, I'd love for you to share with our listeners where they can learn more about you and your work and your book, Calming Teen Anxiety, A Parent's Guide to Helping Your Teen Cope with Worry.
Thank you. Yes. So you can learn more about me and my book through my website, www.sophiagalano.com. You can find me on Instagram, Sophia Vale _Galano. My book is available at Penguin Random House, Barnes and Noble, Amazon, independent booksellers. But if there are any issues finding it, you can reach out to me on the website. There's also an audiobook version too, if you prefer that. But yeah, I hope everyone enjoys reading it and, people can reach out to me with questions anytime.
Well, Sophia, it's a phenomenal book, and I'm excited for our listeners to check it out for themselves because these concepts and tools that you're talking about, mindful observation, active listening, healthy boundaries, these are the strategies that will create better communication between parents and set their teens up for greater success in their life. But for today, thank you very much for your time, and I so appreciate you coming on to our show.
Thank you so much for having me. This was wonderful.
And I want to thank you, our listeners, for taking the time to join us. You can follow us on our social media. Thank you very much for being on our show. I'd want to thank you, our listeners, for taking the time to join us. You can follow us on social media at Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, YouTube, and more at Behavioral Health Today. If you like our show, please give us 5 stars and leave us a review. And as always, the resources for this episode and an archive of all of our other episodes can be found on our webpage at triadhq.com/BHT. And we look forward to having you back with us next time on Behavioral Health Today. We appreciate all the support from our community, and if you like our show, one of the best ways you can support it is by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review. Behavioral Health Today is a podcast part of the Triad Behavioral Health Network, all rights reserved.